It is now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, President of the National Association of State Energy Officials, David Terry. David has worked with NASIO in a variety of capacities since 1996 and has been president since 2008. NASIO is combined of all of the nation's 56 state, territory, and District of Columbia energy offices, as well as 140 private sector affiliate members from energy-related businesses and industries. NASIO supports state energy offices' development of new energy policies and programs and represents the view of the offices in federal energy policy and budget matters in every energy area. States rely heavily on NASIO to help keep abreast of all the energy-related activities and issues, and they serve as a great resource for us. David and his team have been particularly valuable in helping us and other states stay on top of all the energy-related funding opportunities and help us wade through those programs. We are very fortunate to have David here to speak to us about the growing role of renewable energy. Please help me welcome David Terry.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I was thinking as in John and Sarah's remarks about something John said in particular, that whether you move forward or not, making a choice about all of the opportunities in front of us, they're overwhelming. And you heard Sarah run through some of those. It's actually a small portion of the opportunities, and it is overwhelming. And I think that when I look across all of our members, we represent, as Sarah mentioned, all 56 state and territory energy offices around the country, including Nebraska's. I come to Nebraska a couple of times a year. I have a lot of friends here, and so I enjoy coming back. But we just had our national annual meeting last week, so I got to meet literally with almost every state energy director in the country, and you get a feeling for what they're thinking about these opportunities as well. And I thought I would share a little bit about that first, and then maybe some trends that we see and a few solutions we see popping up to try to at least narrow down some opportunities as you consider what to do in Nebraska. And I think that competition among the states is generally healthy. I'm rooting for a few in particular states. I'm not supposed to because I represent them all, but Nebraska is one of those. I always want Nebraska to do well, and Ohio to do well, and Virginia to do well. Those are adopted homes for me. But with that in mind, the context out there in energy and the transition that's underway, it's been underway for quite a while. A lot of people in the room know that already, whether it's renewables or efficiency or new technologies in every area. We even had at the NASIO annual meeting this last week a group of companies that are working on fusion energy, which you would think is quite distant in the future, 20, 30 years. It is probably a whole lot closer. So a lot of really exciting things, and I want to come back to that at the end of my remarks. But first, to put some more context around where we are, we have more than half the states in the country are pursuing aggressively from a policy perspective, from the governor and the legislature's perspective, decarbonization. Zero energy power, decarbonization of building sector, industry, transportation, that is the path they are on. And they have been on it for a while, and I don't think it's going to change. I think that is where they're headed. At least the other half of the states are in some way, shape, or form, in almost every case, doing some version of that. In North Dakota and Wyoming, Louisiana, they're trying to decarbonize their oil and gas sector, for example, and they're serious about it. The governor's serious about it in those states. And so are the companies that are operating in those states. So a lot of different versions of this and where this country is headed all at the same time. I think the other thing that's happening sort of at the same time is a confluence of electricity issues. We see electrification of transportation. We're at the very front end of that. If you're in California, it's 25% of the vehicles sold. If you're in the Southeast, it's nowhere near that number. But the epicenter of electric vehicle construction and battery construction in the United States is the Southeast. Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee especially. They are booming. They are moving forward. They're going to count at some point on clean power from states like Nebraska. The data centers we have in Virginia are driving power demand. There are so many. 2/3 of the internet traffic in the country goes through Virginia. There's this confluence of electricity, demand for clean electricity. John mentioned it, and that continues to move forward. As you look around the corner 10 years out, you see that. I think the other thing that we see emerging when I talk to states like Utah and California and Georgia, they're looking at pilots to how they manage the demand for electricity. Every single region in the country has some kind of electricity stress going on or around the corner. In the Southeast, which has always had a very stable grid, they have been facing regular problems with power reliability because there is so much demand for electricity and so much demand for clean electricity too. And I think where we see the innovation happening is in states that are taking a multi-prong approach with this, bringing more wind and solar on the grid, to be sure, more firm power, clean firm power. There's a huge interest. 32 states have joined a coalition with NASIO, my association, and the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners to advance small modular reactors to offer firm power to pair up with renewable power. Pretty amazing stuff. Also looking at more dynamic loads between aggregating of building energy demand, electricity demand, industrial electricity demand in really sophisticated ways. There's a huge project underway in Utah that Pacificor is leading, a Berkshire Hathaway company. And it literally is aggregating the power load of hundreds of homes and businesses, and through artificial intelligence and other control systems, modulating that load in really minor ways at an individual level, but in aggregate, having a huge impact on the grid and helping to balance renewable power, firm power, emissions, a whole variety of things, cost, et cetera. So these multi-prong approaches, we hope, will allow more renewable power to the grid. The other area, and this sort of falls into the solution set, and it's not anything you all don't know, but the level of interest and need in transmission across the major seams in different parts of the country, but particularly to move power out of renewable power out of Nebraska and other plains states is critical. It was critical for a long time, I think, from the perspective, I don't want to speak for Nebraska, but states like Nebraska that have surplus clean power to sell at very affordable prices, critical from an economic perspective. Now it's critical from a reliability perspective, moving power around. We've seen what happened with the storms in Texas going on 2 years ago now. We've had similar things happen in the Southeast and in the West. That transmission capability is huge on the one hand. On the other hand, it seems almost impossible to move forward. We have some great incentives, both tax incentives and some of the grant funding that Sarah alluded to around grid resilience, for example. There's a major new Department of Energy competitive offering to help states, literally for state governments, to look at economic development around transmission. So one of the biggest transmission barriers is really not environmental in the sense of NEPA, the EPA reviews. Those are certainly significant, but it's more what's in it for me. If you're trying to run a transmission line through a state or a community, what's in it for them? And I think looking at the economic development aspects will help move transmission forward. It is not fast, it's not easy, but has to happen from a variety of perspectives. There's also a major policy change that was in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that passed now almost 2 years ago. And that was really around planning. Some of the dollars that come through offices such as the Nebraska Energy Office for planning around grid planning is to help enable some of those transmission discussions at the state and local level to hopefully move that forward. The other place it's happening, the Department of Energy and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission are designating national corridors of interest where transmission needs to be built from a power reliability perspective and from an economic perspective. It won't get it built, but it does help prioritize it. So it's an area that deserves a lot of attention. I think it is not fast, and that is the downside. The good news is a lot of people are focused on it. There's a lot of incentives. The bad news is it still takes 10 years to build a transmission line, which is kind of unconscionable, but that is where we are. I think the other piece of this, though, on the solution side, are what I mentioned earlier. There are more and more incentives around energy storage. We have a huge tax credit for that, which pairs beautifully, of course, with wind. There's a new energy storage technology. A plant is under construction in West Virginia that delivers 8-hour utility scale storage at a pretty reasonable price. Amazing leaps forward that we need to integrate and bring as part of the system. The other piece of this on the solution side, though, I think is one of looking at these two bills, the IRA and the IIJA, the two major energy bills, and you think about all the grant money. You heard Sarah talk about some of it. Some of NASIO's job, what we do is, it isn't to go out and grab the money, the taxpayer money. Rather, it's when Congress is going to move money, We think it ought to be in the hands of the states. We think they make a better decision than Washington, D.C. led programs. And we think private sector makes a better decision. And that's what we try to do. So if this pie chart that I'm imaginary that I'm holding up was both of those bills in total, all of that grant funding and everything everybody's talking about is there. It's less than a third. 2/3 of it is tax, where the private sector and to a degree nonprofit and public sector can participate. And I think for wind and solar, it's not only the tax credits for those two technologies, it's the tax credits for the supporting things that help enable more development and the economics of that. Energy storage, transmission, dynamic loads, planning of the grid, all the activities that can happen with that. So I think thinking of it more holistically is what I'm getting at. Although wind and solar are your interest, you need to enable it in some way. We have excess wind and solar in a lot of states. We need to get it either out of the state to sell it or use it in state to have value add of some kind. Hydrogen is certainly an opportunity for that. I think the other thing I wanted to really relay about all of the panoply of things that are out there in the tax space is to also think not only about utility scale wind and solar, but of course community solar. Sarah mentioned that. We now have in the tax code for the next 10 years direct pay. So if you're a nonprofit or a community entity that doesn't have a tax liability, there is direct pay tax credits for the next 10 years for solar. The same is true for geothermal. Geothermal energy, both not just geothermal at the utility scale for power production, but geothermal heating and cooling, geothermal loops. Colorado is really pushing forward in this area using tax credits there where you have the advantage of not being such a burden on the grid. It's much less a power impact on the grid and certainly decarbonizing. But the big news is it's lower cost for the homeowner. There's a big upfront cost and the tax credit almost takes care of that upfront cost. It's an amazing sort of breakthrough. Imagine the ability to pair that with other renewables going on in the state. In a state like Nebraska, where oil and gas production, coal production is not part of the picture, everything you produce in state, the dollars stay in state. If you look at those renewable charts that Sarah had up earlier, I always wish that something that's really not available generally, but I always wish that we had another chart next to it that one of the national labs could develop that shows how many dollars stay in the state when you do that, the economic development that comes with that. I think that's a key thing to think about. I think maybe one of the elephants in the room is workforce. And it's true that we have since COVID had a robust economy, a lot of that driven by federal spending, but not all of it. And we've had workforce problems. Well, we had workforce shortages before that too. We have a demographic problem in the United States. We lack enough workers at a younger age, and there are too many people my age. And that's not going to change. And I think that's the other challenge in building these projects, whether it's a heavy infrastructure project or a technology-oriented electricity project or whatever it is, both a lack of trained workforce, but people to actually do it. And that's the other competition Nebraska and other states are in for, trying to get people to move to your state, to take those jobs that are available and to train them. We were just in North Dakota this summer with a number of the states from the central region, which includes Nebraska and our region. They have an amazing workforce training program there for a whole variety of energy sectors as an example. And I think that's an example of a state that's really focused on the energy workforce. That's the good news. The bad news is they don't have enough people to train. And I don't think there's an easy resolution to that, but in some ways that's driving the cost of these technologies as much as anything. One last thing I wanted to leave you with, I purposefully chose not to run through a laundry list of all of the tax incentives and credits. You can find those easily enough online. You probably have heard a lot of them, but I think that there's a lot of doom and gloom right now. Certainly not a lot of good things in the news, whether it's in Congress or in Israel or in Ukraine or wherever you look. Also, the energy transition for a lot of people, we wonder what that means about cost. But I was thinking back about when I first got introduced to Nebraska, it was 2008. I came out to work with the Governor's Wind and Solar Coalition. And things were pretty grim then. We had $100 oil, $10 natural gas, financial crisis upending things. We were importing far more oil than we were producing. Solar and wind were at least twice as expensive then as they are now. And you look now, we had 13 million barrels a day of oil produced in the United States last month, record. We've never produced that much ever. We supplied 60% of Europe's natural gas, and natural gas, if you want to buy it now, Henry Hub is still under $3. which is unbelievable. And the major oil companies and gas companies are serious about decarbonizing what they do. At the same time, we've got wind and solar, which is so abundant here, and prices have dropped from that time period by more than half. Storage has dropped by more than 70%, and it's still dropping, and it's going to keep dropping. And we have this opportunity of transmission, so many pieces that are the envy of every country in the world. Nobody else has that. Nebraska's advantage is just as amazing. You have a great workforce. You have a great place to live, a stable economy. You have biofuels that you're adding value to, wind and solar that you're adding value to. The pieces we need are the hard ones: transmission, workforce, companies and the state making good decisions about how they allocate all of these grants, certainly. And I know Sarah's office and Jim will do a fantastic job of that. And private companies that take advantage of these tax incentives, not only at the utility scale, but also at the building level, at the community level. In the case of large institutional buildings, apartment buildings, hospitals, schools, universities, et cetera, there's a tax credit that's been around a long time. It was expanded dramatically under these two bills called 179D. It's for efficiency improvements, new chillers, new et cetera, whatever you want to do, windows, insulation. That's valuable. But we work closely with large commercial real estate firms around the country, and they're telling us the more valuable piece is the solar tax credit. So in suburban office parks, they're doing that 179D efficiency improvement to the building, and they're adding on-site solar cost effectively with the tax credit, and community solar, et cetera. All of those pieces fit together. So I think it's, again, just to wrap up, I think it's this more comprehensive look. We're used to taking a siloed look at, and I've done it myself many times, but utility scale solar, utility scale wind, all these other pieces fit together. That's what's going to allow you to expand it, and I think extract more value out of the energy that's produced here in Nebraska.